Welcome to the Chapter 4 video lectures. This is on verbal messages. And we've been looking at sociology basically for the past few chapters. Now we're going to kind of switch to, it's basically an intro to linguistics. And we're going to talk about words and speech and that part of communication. So I might ramble a little bit. This is an area I find really interesting. So what is language? Language, or speech at least, is the verbal part of communication, and it consists of utterances. Utterances are a unit of sound bound by the speaker's silence. So it's any sound that has silence on each side of it. It's the portion of talking where you're actually making noise rather than the silences in between. Conversation alternates between utterances and turn-taking. And these are normally in the form of words, obviously. So, some fun facts. Normally, spoken language comes first and then written. So, in every language, writing things down is a later development, if it even appears at all. A lot of cultures that we don't really know that much about, or that we've assumed are barbarian, we've actually found out were quite civilized. They just didn't have language in the way that we think of. They didn't write things down. They just spoke them. We know that people managed to solve many, many problems through language in the ancient world, but we don't know how they solved the problems because they just didn't write things down for us. Written language is therefore often a visual representation of sound or speech. It's a way of documenting on a piece of paper the sounds that are being made. And in some ways, I like to think of music here. The same way that a bar of music, each of those notes is a representation of a sound, and for instance, a quarter note is the length of time for that sound. Language is also something similar. It's just a physical, written representation of sounds. In most culture, poetry actually appears before prose because it's easier to memorize. You'd think it'd be the opposite because poetry is often considered this high-class type of writing, but actually, the first writing in almost all cultures is poetry because it works well with oral tradition. And English comes from the West Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. I'm not sure why I included that, other than the fact that I think it's really cool. Some people like to call English a Romantic language or a Latinate language. It's actually not. It's a Germanic language. In fact, some of the crazy grammar rules we have, maybe you struggle with comma usage, or you're not sure why you can't split an infinitive. A lot of those were artificially added in the 17th and 18th century by a bunch of grammarians who thought it would be fun to make English more like Latin. And it's ended up causing a great deal of confusion ever since. So those are just some fun things about language and speech that I thought were interesting and maybe relevant here. But we'll go back and we'll kind of talk more about what language is and how languages work now. So a language is a system of symbols that is used by people to communicate. Languages consists of lexicons, phonologies, morphology, and syntax and grammar. A lexicon is a collection of words or expression, or the vocabulary used in that language. Phonology are the sounds that are used to produce words. You might think of syllables, or you might think of each letter of the alphabet. So A, B, A, Ba, those are part of phonology. Morphology, this isn't in the book, but it is the process of word creation. A recent example that I like is adulting, which kind of describes the process of acting like an adult, but it's often kind of tongue-in-cheek to point out that adulting is really quite a myth. Morphology would describe the process by which that word came into existence. And syntax and grammar are the rules for combining words to form sentences. And all languages have these things. They have a lexicon, phonology, morphology, syntax and grammar. There's some other characteristics, but we don't necessarily need to go into those right now. So, language and speech communities. A language community is all speakers of a given language. So everyone who speaks English is part of the English language community. But we also have, within that, we have speech communities. So speech communities are a unique form of a more general language spoken by a culture or co-culture. English is spoken on almost every continent. But you may know that the dialects and the accents of British English are very different than Australian English, are very different than American English. And so each of those are a speech community. So British English is a speech community, Australian English is a speech community, Southern American English, those of us who speak with a Southern accent, these are speech communities. Within speech communities, you have dialects, which are accents and specific vocabulary that is used by that region. It would be the difference between how we speak maybe here in the South and maybe how someone speaks up in New York. And then continuing on down from more general to more personal, you have your idiolect. And your idiolect is your individual way of speaking or communicating. There are individual variances in pronunciation, punctuation, and vocabulary that characterize your unique voice. And that's your idiolect. So some American dialects, I just kind of wanted to show you some of the speech communities here in the U.S. Within the language community of English. So here, these are some American English dialects and where they're most common. Even within these dialects, though, you'll see variances. Someone from Florida doesn't speak the same way as someone from Alabama, and someone from Kentucky or Texas maybe doesn't speak the same way as we do here. So there are even more regional subsects of it, and we don't need to like memorize those or anything. This is just to illustrate that language is different depending on where you're at, and even within the same language, people use it in different ways. So here's some dialects of English across the world, everywhere that it is spoken, and how the language kind of is different in those places, particularly in places where it's a first language versus a second language. And so you can see there's a lot of different speech communities within this overarching language community. So let's talk a little bit about some characteristics of language. Actually, I think I'm going to stop this PowerPoint here because I know this is going to go over. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this one, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to talk about what these things mean. So I'll be back in just a moment.